is the LGBTQA Plus Resource Center from the University of Nebraska.
My name is Robin Bowman, and I work for the university and have been doing these panels for a whole lot of years, like 16 years or so. I identify as queer and genderqueer. I am married to a woman, and with her, I have 3 stepkids who are a freshman in college, a freshman in high school, and an 8th grader. And then we have a 3-year-old together as well. So I guess I kind of can speak from that perspective of having children in the school system and that kind of stuff, and raising kids, since I know that, you know, a lot of you are here because you're interested in providing safe spaces for children. In addition to that, I guess I've just been kind of active with advocacy and activism, both on campus and in the community. So I'm a member of UNL's Committee for GLBT Concerns, which helps make UNL's environment safe and welcoming for members of the LGBT community. In addition, I was one of the founders of Outlink, which is Lincoln's LGBT community organization. I helped put together Nebraska's first statewide LGBT advocacy conference, and directed the Plus One Nebraska campaign that got Employee Plus One benefits for University of Nebraska employees. So I have some advocacy experience in that kind of stuff as well, and can speak to those issues.
Hello, I'm Kristin Grosskopf. I'm a developmental psychologist from EdPsych, but I moved over to criminal justice a few years ago. It seems like I can do more social justice work there. I'm also currently president of PFLAG. Happens to be an organization that's been around for a long time. We're in our 36th year. We have a parent national organization and a lot of smaller community organizations. And in that role, we provide support, education, and advocacy for our LGBT youth. So we're glad everyone here is interested in learning ways to provide more supportive environments for our kids.
Hi, I'm Abbi Unis. I'm 31. I'm a bisexual woman. I sometimes identify as pansexual, but most people have at least heard of bisexual. So I kind of gauge the audience that I'm around, and then I decide which term I want to use and how much educating I want to do. I am married to a man, been married about 1.5 years. My background is in education. I worked for 11 years as part of a math and science center for K through 12 kids. And I also worked in an elementary school as a site coordinator, which was sort of a social work role. So I kind of have that background. I don't have any kids of my own, but I love kids. I love working with kids, so I have some experience in the school system. So I'd love to talk to you a little bit more about that, as well as some of my experiences coming out and some of the resources available in schools.
Hello, my name is Andira Losh. I am currently on the Outlink board. I founded Common Root. We do most notably Fall for Pride. I'm involved in organizing the local trans support organization. Basically, I organize a lot of family-friendly events. There's a lot of children, a lot of people who identify any which way. I've been together with my partner, who I'm married to for about 13 years now. We'd like to adopt and love children. We have 2 birds. And I guess I'll say more in a bit. Question number 1, what would have been helpful for you growing up? School support, what was helpful? I suppose what would have been helpful for me would have been ways to reach out, to connect to people and have a sense that my identity was valued and represented in the school system. Kind of skipped over my identity. I should maybe mention that now. I identify as a non-binary woman. I've been out for a number of years now. And it was difficult growing up in a society where there weren't trans experiences modeled. There wasn't any way to sort of validate who I am or have role models for that. So those probably would have been the most helpful things. Also, people looking out for children and for people's diverse needs and identifying those needs and helping me in that case to find the resources that I need. That would have probably been most helpful. I've always been a rather self-directed learner, and I am starting to get into the next question, so I'll leave it at that.
I think one of the things that would have been helpful for me is just having school personnel who were open-minded. Of course, your own identity is a part of how you provide services for kids. But the high school that I went to, we were able to get a GSA, a Gay Straight Alliance, and it seemed like the administration as well as other students in the school were so concerned with getting rid of it. There wasn't much of a safe space. There were a few teachers who would allow us to meet and talk, but for the most part, it was a pretty hostile environment. And it got to the point where they finally did decide that it was too much of a problem, it was distracting other students, and they banned it and they got rid of it. And that was really hard. So that was at a time when I was questioning my sexuality, and so I didn't end up coming out until much later. I think mostly just because I felt like I wasn't accepted. And I think if the personnel in the school just would have been more open and willing to be supportive, regardless of their own personal views, that would have been really helpful for me personally.
Well, it was forever ago when I was in school, but, and I guess I didn't really think too much specifically about my sexuality probably until I was into college. But I think one of the reasons that a lot of times people may delay thinking about things is because we're not really presented with information that lets us know that that's a possibility. We live in a very heterosexist society. So when you think about it, most of the images that you see on TV of couples are heterosexual couples. Most of the, the stories that you read, the couples that are in there are going to be heterosexual couples and that kind of stuff. People notice when there are gay characters on TV or when there's a gay couple portrayed because it stands out, because we don't see it a whole lot, right? But think of how often you see heterosexual relationships portrayed in the stories that you read or watch and that kind of stuff. And then what there is of sex ed in the school system is very heterosexist as well. I mean, I remember there being a mention of the fact that like gay and lesbian people exist when I had sex ed in school, but that was about the extent of it. You didn't really talk about, what LGBT identities were or what, same-sex relationships look like or any of that sort of thing. So kids are just sort of presented with one option. Like, we grew up in a society where everyone seems to be heterosexual until proven otherwise, so that makes it more difficult. If there was just some more awareness of the fact that there are same-sex couples, and we tried to tone down the heterosexism a little bit, even when you're given examples in class and just making up stories or whatever, like, why not throw in a same-sex couple occasionally? It doesn't have to be about the fact that they're a same-sex couple, but it just is a different family structure, So I think that would be helpful. The other thing that I usually say is like having visible signs of inclusion in your classroom can be very helpful. So I don't know if any of you have seen like the ally or safe space cards that some people have in their offices or rooms or whatever that have like a pink triangle on them or some other symbol, or even like the Human Rights Campaign logo that's kind of a blue square with a yellow equal sign on it, or like the rainbow flag is also identified with the LGBT community. So having those visible signs of inclusion displayed can be really helpful for kids. Most people aren't even going to notice that you have that little thing there, but to a kid who is questioning their identity, that's going to stand out and speak volumes, that they're going to know that you're a safe person that they can talk to or go to for support.
I think it's important to consider not just even in the broad spread media, but when I was growing up and you look in the materials, they're all very, examples are heterosexual, they're boys and girls, there's no variance. When you look at it, you get this feeling like either you don't exist or you're not recognized, or at least you're not valued enough to be represented in the materials that are given. And if you're coming from a place, a family, a background, the people around you, you don't feel accepted or safe, you're going to expect that people are not safe, that people will not accept you or value you. So there are many important ways, as you just mentioned, that we can show children that they're accepted, that they're valued in a space. And I think it's important to consider that by default, a lot of people feel unsafe And that means it's hard to function in an environment if you feel unsafe, if you're uncertain about yourself, if you don't think it's okay to be questioning, if you don't think it's okay to not have a sense of who you are completely, to not know everything, to not be able to justify yourselves to others. And that's a huge pressure. And that's why it's important to just put it out there that you accept people, whoever they are, whatever their sexuality or gender identity is, because people come from a default sense that it's not okay, that they're not represented, and just being kind of traumatized by that erasure every day. So I think it's important to counter that in as many ways as possible. How did your school environment enable or disable your comfort in coming out? Well, I think I covered that a little bit in just not having a sense of having any models or having anything reflected, any sense that people like me existed. It wasn't really until high school there was an LGBT organization that I could be a part of, and most people were afraid to be in that. And there was a lot of fear in that, and a lot of the conversation in the group was just how much teachers were not handling slurs, they were not standing up for students, they were not letting things slip and not helping students to feel safe. And there's a lot of ramifications from that. That sort of trauma, depression, and just inability to focus, and everything that comes with that sort of traumatization. So and there's plenty of reasons and red flags that come out of that when you see that students aren't able to function in school. So again, I feel it's really important to be able to engage students, to put out that sense of acceptance, and to be willing to listen, and have the students be able to have someone to come to and talk about those problems, because it wasn't very long ago that those resources didn't exist at all, and there was nowhere for anyone to turn.
I want to agree with that wholeheartedly. So I shared a little bit with you about my experience in high school. So it wasn't until I got to college that I found an organization that I could join. And one of the things that really surprised me, and I think kind of kept me from coming out even longer, was there wasn't really any friendliness for bi people in the group. So I oftentimes got met with, you're just greedy, you don't want to pick one side or the other, or you've only dated men so far, so you're not actually bisexual. So feeling like I had to prove myself, or when I did finally have a girlfriend, her friends making me feel like I wasn't good enough for her because I'd only dated men before. So that was really hard because it was a school-sponsored group. I mean, in college, usually it's run by students. Oftentimes there's not like faculty oversight or anything. But I was really surprised that there wasn't more openness, and I think that's something that bi students, there's more and more of them, but are still kind of facing. There's a lot of hatred from both sides. So they might face discrimination from their straight peers, but they might face some sort of discrimination or misunderstanding from peers who identify as part of the LGBTQ community or an identity within that. So I think it's really important for school personnel to have an understanding of the diversity within each of the identity groups. So even within the B, there's a lot of diversity, right? And there's a lot of different types of people. And I think that's something that's really important, and to help students stand up for themselves among their peers as well.
The other thing that I talk to teachers about a lot of times is that I think one of the most important roles you play is that you kind of set the tone for your classroom, right? You kind of set what the rules of engagement are within that space, and how the children will interact with one another, and how you'll interact with them, and that sort of thing. And so you're a model of how to treat one another with kindness, with empathy, and with respect. And so I think it's really important that you take that role seriously. And then when you see that maybe kids are, bullying someone, making fun of them, using slurs and that kind of stuff, that, there's just a zero tolerance kind of thing. And it doesn't have to be like heavy handed, but, you catch it and you're like, oh, no, like that's not how we interact with people in our classroom. Like we treat each other with respect here. We don't call names and that kind of stuff, and just set it from the very beginning that, in your space when you're around, like, no, there's higher expectations for how we interact with one another and how we talk to our classmates and that sort of thing. And it can be really powerful for a kid to know that at least somebody has their back and will stand up to them. And like I said, you don't have to do it in a way that ostracizes the kid who, messed up and called somebody a name or whatever, but just raise the bar in terms of how we treat one another.
I want to just quickly add something that's a really good point. I think one other thing that's really helpful is if a kid does come to you, believe them. So a lot of times bullying doesn't happen in front of you. Kids are pretty good about not getting caught and doing things in front of adults that they know are going to get them in trouble. So if a kid comes to you and says something, or even if they say that another adult said something that made them feel uncomfortable, validate that, believe them. That will help build that trust, and it'll help them feel like they're not so alone, that there's someone who will stick up for them, and at least believe them when they say something happened.
On something that we talked about earlier too, in terms of how do you make a classroom welcoming and whatnot. Well, we're talking about oftentimes people who are pre-verbal about these things. So to have the visuals, you talked about the safe space signs and representations of a variety of relationship groups is so important because, again, we start with visuals, right? So to leave out different people who exist in society just delays a mutual understanding and acceptance, I think. And I'm glad you brought up bullying too, because we've spent a lot of time, even in the school system, talking about how do we address bullies, and there's so much focus on bullying. It seems like we kind of lose sight of, well, what is it we do want then? So for quite a while, I was even in my classes talking about, okay, well, we all know we don't want bullying, and we talk about how do you address bullying. But if you focus on the behaviors you want, then it's not all about the bully, right? If we focus on how it is we want to treat each other, then all the other stuff is kind of just a part of it, if that makes sense.
An example that I would give, it wasn't until high school that I saw one of my teachers who was very, very adamantly pro-LGBT rights and active in being supportive in ways. And before that, I didn't see people doing that. And he was a straight white man too. So that really struck me, that someone who wasn't in our community valued us. And it doesn't take many people within a school to be those models, to show that, hey, we actually do value all students, and we're willing to talk about it. We're willing to stick up for people. We're willing to take the measures to make people feel safe. Because if things are kept quiet, if people aren't standing up for the students that feel like they don't have a place, then there's a default sense that that we're not welcome in places, not welcome when we're young as children. So again, have to kind of reverse that dynamic, have to have even a few people be clearly supportive of children in all of the diverse configurations. How did your school environment affect your academic performance and social interactions with peers? I would say my school environment, even from a young age, I remember at kindergarten, was really traumatizing because children are so often split by gender and treated in a gendered way. And so I was kind of segregated from the gender that I more closely identified with. And that was awful to me, and I didn't understand what was going on, and I was just kind of filled with disgust and suffered tremendously for that. And there wasn't really any way to have a conversation or anyone that I could reach out to or anyone that talked to me about that. So how that affected me, I spent a lot of time by myself. I was depressed for a really long time. I had a number of times where I was just really unable to perform in school, and that was generally responded to in a negative way, in a punitive way. And so that really, really tore me down and really destroyed my confidence in a lot of ways, especially because when I tried, I could really perform at a pretty high level. So really, that came back to me in a sense of guilt that I couldn't perform the social role that was required of me. So all of those factors really, really worked to make it impossible for me to function in school, impossible to feel comfortable or to socialize properly, or even really to be able to handle my feelings. And that's something that's so rarely taught, is just emotional self-awareness, compassion for others, reaching out to people, being supportive of others. Those are tools that I didn't have because I didn't have them from my family background or my cultural background, and those weren't strongly present in my school environment. It's really up to individual teachers and people who are running programs in schools to provide those for students. So it makes a tremendous difference where people grow up and when they grow up and what resources that are available to survive. These are life and death issues for a lot of students. So you fall into depression, you don't have support systems, and not only can you not function in school, you can't survive. And I'm fortunate to have been able to recover from that, and that's why I'm here today.
So I started out in Catholic school for elementary and middle school, and then switched to public school for 8th grade through high school. And I also excelled academically at a pretty early age. But I was also what we now call a tomboy, I guess. So in Catholic school, you have to wear uniforms. And so I would typically wear the uniform that looked more like what the boys were wearing. And I think that mixed with, oftentimes getting the top grade in class made me kind of a target. So I'd often be bullied at school, and that was a big reason why I switched to public school when I did. But the result was, once I switched to public school, almost my entire focus was on fitting in. So I didn't go out for advanced programs. I was completely focused on making friends, making sure my friends liked me, not standing out. So I think I could have probably done a lot more in terms of going to advanced placement programs and things like that, but I just felt like I didn't want to be a target any longer. And I think some of that, like I said, may have been just because I stood out because I was getting good grades, but part of it too, I think, was a little bit because I stuck out because of how I was presenting myself, and that was clearly very discouraged. And even within a school where you have required uniforms, even dress is extremely gendered and can make you kind of stick out in that way. So yeah.
I'm kind of with Robin. That was too long ago for me, and identity wasn't an issue then. Feeling safe, I think, would be a common theme, though. We've talked quite a bit about how important it is for people to feel safe, even if they feel different. But piggybacking a little bit on what you just said, it's a human need to feel a part of some group, right? Or to feel connected in some way. And when we ostracize kids, they just become at risk for all sorts of horrible things. And we just lost another trans female student in western Nebraska about a month ago. And usually I would have said, if the family is supportive, you can buffer your environment. But my understanding in this case was that the family was very supportive, the school was not. So we have a lot of reasons to support our kids for however they identify. And there was a question in there, too, about how early do we talk about this with kids. It used to be at 5 years old, kids understood gender. Now I think we're down to 3 years old. I don't think there's a time that's too early. If they're asking questions, they deserve answers. And hopefully we're not ostracizing them if they feel different. And one of the ways they can that can buffer them feeling different is to have a lot of visuals in their spaces at school or people they can turn to help them feel part of the community.
One point I wanted to add to that is I think it's important to consider the invisibility of students who have those struggles. Like sexuality isn't evident, gender identity isn't evident. That's hidden for a reason because there are dangers in that lack of sense of safety. So I recall that so often as seeing examples of people, but like being hidden because of fear. And so people assume that you are the facade you create to stay safe. And so now that we see more students feeling more comfortable to be out in the right situations, people kind of think that somehow the LGBTQ plus population has increased. And it's not an increase in the population, it's an increase in feeling safe to be yourself. And so I think it's important to consider that people who identify and experience life in different ways than the sort of heterosexual cis-normative dynamic are all around us, and are often just afraid to be themselves, and to expect that that's the reality we live in, and not just assume, again, that people are the normative way that is most broadly represented in our culture by default, because that's a facade that we need to look under. So now I guess we're moving on to the card questions. And this is, perhaps we can more fully answer this. At what age should we educate about students concerning sex and gender versus identity, gender expression versus sexual orientation? Because if we don't educate, where will they find information? And I'm going to echo what was just said. Most of the time, if someone is willing to ask the question, they're looking for the answer and they're looking for the resources. I feel like growing up, a lot of the times when I would ask questions, I would be shrugged off or deterred or just kind of left without a way to go. And that told me that my questions were not valued, that my considerations in who I am was not considered valid. So that as a way of kind of scarring you and keeping you away from trying to reach out and connect to people and find the answers and find the resources that you need. And that's why a lot of people are at risk and are doing things that are not safe or are not taking care of themselves because they've been shut out, even if unintentionally at times, by people who are not responding or giving resources that are needed. And that's dangerous.
I think kids are, some kids at least, depending on the resources they have, can be pretty resourceful. There's so much information now online that kids can look up information themselves, but I think it's really important for there to be some caution there. We know that not everything we read online is accurate or safe for kids. So I think it's dangerous to assume that, kids can just find that stuff, they'll look it up online and it'll be fine, because that could be unsafe for kids. But also, it's really important for them to have someone that they look up to and respect, validate that back to them. So if you're able to help them navigate those resources, that can be really helpful. I know a website that I found really helpful is bi.org, and it has people from all over the U.S., all over the world share their own stories about coming out. And then there's information about celebrities who identify that way, and there's hot topics that people can talk about. So there are some sites that are pretty kid-friendly, but the more that you make yourselves aware of it and you validate that that is a good resource for kids and that you're willing to have that dialogue, I think is really helpful.
I double underline what you just said about getting help finding resources. I've spent a lot of time, even with my university students, understanding how to detect whether the information you're finding online is valuable or verifiable and whatnot. So you can actually become a huge resource in helping students find positive resources, because we know there are a lot of very unhelpful and anti-LGBTQ information out there. So knowing what resources are available for kids would be hugely important, I think.
Yeah, in terms of at what age, I think, we start teaching kids about this as soon as they're able to talk. I mean, we're learning about sexuality and gender from a very young age. Kids who are in daycare have a sense of boy and girl and that sort of thing. And a lot of times we send messages to them that like, oh, these are boys' toys and these are girls' toys or whatever. And we need to knock that off. I mean, what is the point of that? There's no reason that a girl can't play with trucks, a boy can't play with dolls and that kind of stuff. They're toys. Play with them. All kids play with toys, I don't think it's good to segregate kids. But, boys group and a girls group or whatever. Like, why do that? Put them in alphabetical order. First half of the alphabet over here, second half there. Oh, you have on these color shirts, go over there. You have these color shirts, go over there. If you're, find a different way to put people in groups if you have to divide them instead of boys and girls and that sort of thing. Try to just watch your language that you're using and that kind of stuff as well, because some people aren't going to necessarily identify as boy, girl. The other thing I was going to put a plug in for, there is a really great sexuality curriculum out there called Our Whole Lives, and it was developed by the Unitarian Universalist Association, the UCC Church. So is that, what's that stand for, though?
Unitarian Universalist.
No, but the UCC is a different group. It's what First Plymouth is. So that congregation and Planned Parenthood. And it is a comprehensive, inclusive, across the lifespan sexuality curriculum. And they have classes for kindergarten first graders. So in that class, you're learning names of body parts and you're learning that, your body is yours and about boundaries and that kind of stuff. And, letting people know if anyone tries to touch you and that sort of thing. They have another one that's for 4th and 5th graders. Which just gets a little more complex. And then the really big part of the curriculum is for middle school age, so 7th through 9th grade. And I'm actually certified to teach that one and also the 10th and 12th grade one. But that curriculum, just the one that's for kind of that middle school age, that 7th through 9th grade group, we met for an hour and a half every week for, my goodness, like 20 weeks. It's like a 40 or 50 hour curriculum just for the middle school group. Okay, so when I say it's like comprehensive and inclusive, like it's comprehensive. You talk about everything. And it's very good because it's not heterosexist. It doesn't just present one version of what we're talking about when we say sex. And it gives kids the information that they need to know. And beyond just like the nuts and bolts of sex, it spends a lot of time talking about healthy relationships and building skills for having healthy relationships. It talks about STIs. It talks about, how babies are made and all that kind of stuff as well. But a ton of stuff. It talks about bullying and bystander intervention. It talks about cyberbullying. It talks about, my goodness, just about anything you can imagine. But I love that it's not just like the physical aspect of sex, but it's about relationships and having kids think about what kind of qualities, would it be important when you're choosing a mate and that sort of thing. And then, like I said, there's a high school version, and then they also have adult versions too. So people will still go to these Our Whole Lives classes when they're older and talk about healthy relationship issues and communication within relationships and all of that kind of stuff. So it's a really wonderful curriculum. If you ever have an opportunity to get trained to be a facilitator or are able to steer kids in the direction of being able to go to some of those classes, they're really, really great. Especially for kids who may not identify as cisgender or heterosexual, because it might be the first time that they've really felt seen and heard their story presented and felt like they're validated and that other people feel the way that they do or identify the way that they do. So I think that's hugely important. The other thing that I'd like to say before we move on is, yes, definitely when kids are asking questions, they're ready to get answers. But sometimes we as adults have to bring things up before the kids ask the questions because they may not know how to put their question into words yet, or they may not feel safe to ask it. So find opportunities to, bring up topics and that sort of thing to facilitate discussion, because the fact that you talk about things lets kids know that it's safe to talk about these things. These are not like off limits, voodoo kind of topics or taboo topics that we don't discuss.
We wanted to try to connect
Yeah, so I actually led the Our Whole Lives class through the Unitarian Church. They have a set of facilitators for that program, and each year they're offering at least, one age group. They're offering the class. They kind of cycle it through. But they actually do allow people from the community to come and attend those classes. You don't necessarily have to be a member of that church, but you would have to get in contact with them to find out when they're offering it. I don't know if First Plymouth here also offers Our Whole Lives, but I would think they would because it's such a large congregation. But the curriculum doesn't have to be offered just by the churches. It can be also offered through community agencies and that kind of stuff. So you could maybe Google it and see if there are any community agencies in Lincoln that are also offering it, because it's amazing.
There are other ways to find those resources as well. For example, Outlink has resource directories. There are organizations specifically for gender diverse youth. There's organizations for parents. There's organizations, there's support capacities for high school age students. There's really a lot of resources that are available that you just have to ask the right person to find them. Is like organizations like Outlink or the LGBTQA Resource Center. They have that information and can send you to organizations or people who are running those. There are also additional support groups and options for people. There's conferences and trainings and workshops for people in terms of diversity and inclusion. Definitely, there have been a lot of teachers involved in those, a lot of social workers. Those things are going on constantly. So just ask and you can be plugged into that.
I think it would be ideal if Lincoln Public Schools would offer something like that. Has anyone seen the documentary Where to Invade Next? There was a part in there where he goes to France and the teacher's she's talking about relationships and everything that Robin was talking about. Their sex ed focuses on what you get out of a relationship. It's not focused on the sex act like it seems to be so many times when we have controversies in whether or not to even have sex ed in our schools. So when the teacher was asked, well, don't you talk about abstinence? Remember, she said, well, we've learned it doesn't work. So, we've got people in the room who are armed to provide resources, to be supports for kids, and to provide actual information that could save their lives, improve their lives, and keep them out of danger. We do have, I guess, one more deal.
There's one more
religion.
question.
Yeah.
Yes. Religion and sexuality. Is it possible to disagree about the science and still partner to create loving, supportive environment for youth? Example, I identify with a religion that believes in God's design of man and woman, but I recognize it's complicated. I don't expect everyone to agree with that view, and I support inclusive language for policies. Does holding that conviction alone put me in a category of being unsupportive? My answer for that would be, if you come from a place of compassion, of valuing people and wanting everyone to excel and have opportunities, then it doesn't have to be a conflict. It's only a conflict if you set your principles against people, if you use them to devalue people. And that's really a sense of value. And hopefully people working in educational situations or supporting children are putting them first. And I think that's what matters.
I had an experience in high school where the leader of our student government, he set us up to do these debates in class. So the idea was to talk about these hot button issues and people would debate their views. And at the time, this was probably 2003, I want to say, we were debating same-sex marriage. And so the teacher has us, get into our groups, come up with our arguments, and then right before the debate's going to start, he's like, well, I personally believe that it's morally wrong. It's against my religion. It's like, you are not on the same level as us as students. You're not just one other peer offering your opinion. You are the authority in the classroom. And so that just kind of set the tone for the rest of the day. And it was really hard to speak out and share your own opinion. So I think it's important to recognize that you do hold power. You are an authority figure in that space. And so you're not there to push your own agenda. You're there to advocate on behalf of kids, right? And to do what's best for them. And sometimes that means stepping back and listening to them and doing more listening than talking.
If I'm talking to someone who's asking about that, I might talk about things like, well, I was raised in a Lutheran tradition, and what I know is that Jesus didn't say anything about homosexuality. So that says a lot. And I remembered him also saying he was here to replace the old law. But when it just comes to how do you deal with kids in a classroom, I've simplified it to just this: walk the talk. You don't need to sell a religious perspective on how to interpret the Bible. If you just act as the person you want to be and you'd like for other kids to be, I don't think religion even comes into play.
Yeah, I don't know that I have a ton to add other than, I think everyone is entitled to their own beliefs, but I think that we have a moral obligation to treat everyone with respect and kindness and that kind of stuff. So I feel like I might personally have a hard time holding one sort of belief and still being able to treat people equally, even though in the back of my head, I have this belief that something about their being is inherently wrong. And I don't know. I mean, maybe some people are better at doing that than I would be able to do. At the end of the day, I mean, I think it's important how you treat people, and, are you really able to treat everyone equally, or, treat them with respect and dignity, while in the back of your head, you sort of have this asterisk saying, yeah, but there's something wrong with you. I don't know. I have a hard time with that. But I think what's important is how you treat people.
I think an important point on that is how the dialogue functions, because everyone's not coming to that discussion equally. If the conversation is, should I have equal rights? Should I be able to pursue the things that I want in life? Because that's how I'm going to hear it. And I'm going to hear counterpoints of that as attacks against me, because they're limiting who I can be and what I can do in life. So I think it's important to consider those dialogues while we're debating people's identities and their value in society and what people are allowed to do. How is that affecting people? How is that harmful or empowering or disempowering someone? So there's a lot of control in those debates that are going on, and it's important to consider how that empowers and lets people carry their voice, or how it makes them feel like they're a minority in a classroom that shouldn't have rights because the teacher set that tone. And how are we setting that tone? I feel like if religion comes into that place and it controls the dialogue, then that's harmful. So again, teachers need to be conscientious of how they bring their own values into the classroom and how that affects their students.
So your question is about how do you function? If you're a teacher and stuff and you have a student who's maybe non-binary or exploring their gender expression and that kind of stuff at school, and yet their parents are very non-supportive, how do you create a safe space for them within the school to be themselves? I feel like the school can have policies in terms of, how you allow children to act. And I don't know that the parents get to dictate necessarily what the rules for the school are. So within that, I mean, I think you let a child be who they are. It's hugely damaging when you're trying to stifle a person's self-expression of just who they are. How are they supposed to focus on learning when you're constantly giving them these messages of no, you can't act that way. No, you can't dress that way. No, you can't talk that way. Okay, yeah, you be you, and now let's do our schoolwork.
But it sounds like you've got students who really need the support, and that's why I'm glad we've got people in the school system who can help do that. Because it's tough when you come up against parents who are the ones who are not supportive. And I know that's why the schools struggle with even comprehensive, medically accurate sex education, because there are parents who have issue with that. But right now the law supports you in doing that, so let's hope that stays. But yeah, I just would focus on supporting the student.
It just makes my heart hurt to even hear that story, you know, like, what is it that it takes to get through to the parents when you say, like, your child is suicide? Like, this is seriously a life or death issue. So maybe you don't understand that the person you see as your daughter actually identifies as male. Maybe you don't understand it, but you need to trust your child that that's how they identify, and recognize that you validating that identity could really make the difference between having a child and having a dead child. You know, like, when your child is suicidal over something, it's time to listen and trust them. You know, why would a person just, like, for fun, just decide, oh, I think I'm going to identify differently? You know, like, it's not something that they're just messing around with. Like, that's your child's identity. Validate the person's identity. Like, oh my goodness, it's so, oh my God. Yeah, it just hurts me.
And when I've talked to principals in my PFLAG role, they come across as very supportive. They want parents to come talk to them. And I've had discussions like, well, not all parents are comfortable coming forward, especially if they have trans kids. They're trying to protect their identities and whatnot. So I just want to say, too, if anyone has a question or you don't feel like, or maybe the principal just needs more resources, contact PFLAG. I'd be more than happy to talk to any principals. Maybe it helps that I come from EdPsych, you know, I'm like, you know, family. And we can have conversations about what's going on in school, what the atmosphere is, and we can certainly help them with resources and even put together some presentations.
And it's important to consider, are those resources available anonymously? If parents or students need to find that, can they go somewhere to find where there's a support group or someone to talk to or some way to meet their needs? There's plenty of books written by parents of trans and gender diverse children, children who identify various ways. Those resources are there. And if someone's afraid to find it, how do they find those resources where you work? So something worth thinking about, because I know that they're not evident and obvious in a lot of places.
I guess when I think about, I have a 3-year-old at home, and my wife did have an in-home daycare at our house. So we spent a lot of time with little ones who, you know, as they were developing their verbal skills and stuff. And it's just interesting because we would kind of ask, you know, at different points, like, oh, are you a boy or a girl? And just see, like, at what point they know how to answer that question, you know? And, you know, at this point, our daughter will say, I'm a girl. Like, she finally knows that. But for a while, like, she didn't really know, you know? And it's not something that we push a lot. We try to really watch the messages that we push. We don't assume that our children are straight or cisgender or whatever. We also don't assume that they're gay. But we watch the language that we use in terms of, even with the older kids, I know this isn't exactly what you asked, but even with the older kids, you know, let's say there's like a homecoming dance coming up or something like that. We don't assume that they're going to take somebody of the opposite sex kind of thing. You know, we don't say, oh, do you have a girlfriend? You know, to my stepson, it's just like, oh, are you seeing anyone? Are you dating anyone? Who are you taking to the dance? So that we're not like putting those gendered type words in there. And I think that's really important when you're talking to students. You don't necessarily know how they identify or who they might be interested in, that kind of stuff. So try to avoid gendered language. And it takes some practice, but it gets easier the more that you do it. But also, I would say, even with the young kids in elementary, it may come up just because you might hear somebody use language of, like, telling a little boy, oh, you can't play with a doll, that's a girl's toy or whatever. And you could just say, oh, actually, you know, boys can play with dolls. Maybe he's going to grow up to be a daddy someday. And so he's practicing, you know, like, my wife would do things like that in terms of, it wasn't like you're having some big complex discussion of gender and things. But as you see, you know, things come up or whatever, you'd be like, oh, you know, that's sweet. You know, you're changing the baby's diaper like your daddy does on your baby sister, you know, and so that just sort of like has those messages that come through of like, oh, it's okay for a boy to be nurturing and caring of a baby, you know, and the same thing if girls are being rough and tumble or playing with trucks and that kind of stuff, like, you know, that's fine too. Or, you can just have a discussion. Oh, is it okay that we do this? Or, and yeah, it's okay. Everybody can play with whatever toys and have fun. I'm trying to think of other gendered things that come out early, but I mean, really simple things, and colors. Yes, boys can like pink. I think it's getting more common now because Nike and Adidas put out these fluorescent pink things, these fancy socks that boys wear and stuff. But I don't know, just little things like that. I think plant those messages that it's okay for you to like what you like and be who you are and play what you want to play, and that.
When we're born, we don't have an innate sense of exactly who we are and what we like and who we want to be. I feel like there's this default sense people fall into the roles as they exist, and that's seen as natural. But it's very natural to not know who you are, to not have an absolute sense of everything that is you. And I think it's important to validate it. It's important to validate that process of discovery. And in that conversation, if children don't know the words, they don't understand how to have the questions, then that's okay. They're at the level of comprehension that they have. And I think that's important, not only just in this area, but I recall growing up being really afraid to ask a lot of questions because I had the understanding that I was supposed to know those or have a sense of it. So that to me is just a matter of making the learning environment feel safe and not judgmental, to not have a pressure to know exactly who you are and to have a sense of where you fit in society, because we don't have that when we're born. And just being conscientious of those questions as they come up. To go back to when to talk to kids about things. So when you give someone directions somewhere, you say, if you hit this point, you've gone too far. Well, if kids are already talking to each other about this issue, then you've missed it. You've missed the point where you talk to them about that, because they're already learning lessons in a way, and they're probably not going to learn the best lessons if they don't have all the information and the resources available to them. How do you recommend finding role models and mentors for questioning students? That's a good question.
The first thing that came to my mind is the university has groups of LGBT students, so maybe they could get in touch with the university and see if any of those students would be interested in serving in a mentoring role. I know there was also a group that was getting put together up in Omaha that was specifically for that function, but I don't know. I went to an information session about it probably a year or two ago, but I don't know where it's gone from then. Do you have information about it? It sounds like you knew about it. Ally mentoring, that does sound right. So Omaha has a program set up for that. But I also think it's important just the stories that you tell, as teachers in the classroom and that kind of stuff. If you can find, if you're for younger kids, if there's storybooks that you read that maybe challenge gender norms or maybe have a same-sex couple in it or something like that. And again, it doesn't have to be the point of the story. It just is, just as when it has a mom and a dad in the story, that's not necessarily the point of the story. It just is. Yeah, telling stories or having examples of students, that have different identities can be really helpful. My wife sent me an article yesterday. Julie Andrews is coming out with a new show that's going to be on Netflix, I think, and it has these puppets in it. And one of the puppet characters in her show is actually identifies as gender non-binary. So I thought, that's pretty cool. If Mary Poppins, and Maria von Trapp can have a gender non-binary puppet in her show, that's pretty great.
If there is not already a program like that in your school, most schools I've been in would have an idea of who to send someone to as an example, or if they have a student that you think you want to match up with someone else who could be a role model, there might be someone in the school. Or maybe you could instigate something for such scenarios in your school and see who volunteers.
Or even get in touch with PFLAG.
Or PFLAG, yeah.
And I think it's important to consider the difference between particular role models and peers that children need, because it's great to have role models and see someone who's gone through a lot of your life struggles and understands what we're going through. But it's also important to have relationships with peers who currently have the same struggles, who you can identify with exactly what they're dealing with as their generation, as what's going on now. So just sort of identifying those needs that students have and being able to find those resources. And organizations like Outlink and PFLAG would be able to help orient you towards those options for students. So on to the next one, which connects really well. What services can the LGBTQA+ Resource Center offer students in public schools?
The Resource Center is part of UNL. UNL is a land-grant university, so the university is also here to serve the community. It's my other half who's the director of it, so I can tell you there aren't a lot of people to spread around. I mean, the panel is one great example of a way for the center to help share resources with the community. But what other resources in particular were in question? What we can do. Oh, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So the Resource Center does have an awesome library. Books and videos. They're even part of the Love Library system. So if you can get into the library even on the internet, they're logged in the system. So a lot of talks, presentations.
Where are you located?
Oh, the Resource Center is in the City Campus Union up on the 3rd floor. You can't miss it. They're on one end. There's only, on one end, there's a big window for the LGBTQA Resource Center. Just questions that you can't find answers to anywhere else, that seems to be the go-to place. Outlink has a list of resources, but so does the LGBTQA Resource Center. We've even got resources for counselors who are LGBT friendly. Well, so does PFLAG.
And there's additionally sort of community options that are available to people. Outlink does a Pride Film Festival, which I went to last year, and they had a number of documentaries that were about youth dealing with the pressures of being trans or various issues. And that's really important too, again, to go back to like cultural representation and seeing someone, even if they're not an actual person in your life, who's going through those struggles and seeing what that's like. So options like that are important as well, just getting out in the community and learning and experiencing those media representations.
Yeah, and we don't necessarily go out and do these talks in classrooms with students very often, but I have done some. I guess already this year I've been to Southwest High School. We got to talk to like 15 classes. They came into the auditorium and we talked to them because their National Honor Society was putting on a diversity week to talk about different communities that face bias. And I guess I was the LGBT representative on a multi-identity panel at Southwest High School. I've also went out to Northeast High School a couple of weeks ago. They had a SEED group there, which is like a group of teachers who are all sort of like a book club for teachers, but they're reading a book that will help inform their curriculum or could potentially be used in a classroom. And so they had just read a book about a student who identified as non-binary. And so they had a couple of us come in and facilitate a discussion with that group of teachers and that kind of stuff. And then last week or 2 weeks ago, I was out at Leffler Middle School, again, talking to a group of about 20 teachers about LGBT stuff. So it's less frequent that we, get into the schools with the students, but, if there's groups of teachers in your schools and that kind of stuff, or administrators that want to have a particular, conversation, and it can be broad LGBT stuff, or if you're specifically talking about gender identity issues or trans issues or whatever, you can make that request. Our speakers bureau is called Outspeaking, but it's sort of coordinated through the Resource Center at UNL. But we love going out into the community and having opportunities to talk with people and have these discussions.
What group is having this back too? Right. Anyway, there's also, if you want to check out the topics that we have, PFLAG meets the third Tuesday of every month. And at 6:30, we start with a little social. At 7 o'clock, there's some program. And then at 8 o'clock, support groups for everybody. So one of the programs that one of our board members is planning is having kids, cisgender kids. Does everybody know what cisgender means? Cisgender means that you identify as the gender you were born as, or with your biology. So one of our board members wants to have children who are cisgender who live with gay siblings. So things like that could be informative. You could bring back somehow to the schools. And I'm even thinking when you've got kids at school that it might help to hook them up with other cisgender straight kids who maybe have other gay family members, because there's a point of reference and assuming a lot of acceptance in that too. Our website got hacked though a few months ago, so things are not current right now. Hopefully we'll get that fixed pretty soon, but that's just another idea for where to find new information possibly. Ally and safe space training, that is done through the Resource Center as well. I think there are 4 levels now. There used to just be Ally Space, then Safe Space, then Brave Space, and I can't remember.
Social justice supporter.
Oh, social justice supporter. And everything beyond the safe space requires that you do attend some kind of training. Pat wants you to be able to, go through the training, and she'll sign it to verify you've been through the training. But those are really good ideas, and it's a great way to, get away from the typical workday and just let go and really think about some important things that you can take back with you and put into practice.
So I'm assuming that all the school buildings that you're in or the school systems have some sort of process for clearing people to volunteer in the school. Super awesome. So I think if you are looking for mentors or role models or people just to come in and connect with kids who may be questioning, reach out to these organizations, because like Pat's really great about getting the call out. They have listservs that they can send an email out. So if you're looking for a particular person who's gone through an identity or an experience for a kid to talk to, reach out, see if someone's available. They could be cleared as a volunteer to come in, meet with a kid once a week, a couple of times, just someone to have lunch with. Just having someone who's like you that you can have lunch with can be really empowering. So I know you all have more than enough on your plate. So you're not looking to start another program in your school, but just something to think about.
This is where I bring up my day job. I work at VolunteerLink, which is an organization that essentially supports nonprofits. And it's a place where any nonprofit organization can list their needs and can ask for volunteers. So aside from those resources that exist there, there's always that possibility to look that up and sign up and ask for a volunteer to support whatever your needs are.